In the spring of 1973, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Viroqua, Wisconsin in Vernon County, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Brandt paid $45 for a pair of Belgian draft horses that hadn't worked a field in 11 years. The horses were named Gus and Henry, and they were not impressive. Gus stood 16 and a half hands and had a Roman nose that made him look permanently skeptical. Henry was slightly taller, slightly rounder, and had a hind leg that swung outward when he walked in a way that made every man at that sale wince and look away. Both animals were rough-coated from a winter spent in a leaning shed on the Draper Place, a 200-acre dairy operation that the bank had called in February and was liquidating in April. The harness hanging on the fence post beside them was cracked at every bend point. The traces were stiff as iron pipe, and the hames had been repaired with baling wire in at least 3 places the auctioneer could see, and probably more he couldn't. The auctioneer, a man named Earl Wicks, who had been running sales in Vernon County since 1951, listed them the way a doctor describes a prognosis he doesn't believe in. A matched pair of Belgian geldings, he said. 11 and 12 years of age sound enough. Last worked in 1962. He paused. Good for light farm work, he added, which was the kindest lie available. A scrap dealer from La Crosse bid $15. A man in the back bid $25, looked at Henry's leg, and dropped out. Nora Brandt raised her hand at $45, and nobody followed her. Her brother-in-law, Carl Brandt, was standing 3 feet to her left. He said, "What in the world are you going to do with those?" She said, "Farm." He drove home separately. The story moved through Vernon County, the way all stories move through small farming counties. From the liquidation sale to the feed store in Viroqua, from the feed store to the co-op on County Road B, from the co-op to the lunch counter at the Dairyland Cafe on Main Street, from the cafe to the parking lot of St. John's Lutheran on Sunday morning. By the time it reached the church parking lot, it had acquired details that weren't at the sale. Some versions had her paying $100. Some versions had the horses nearly falling down during the bidding. All versions agreed on the essential absurdity. Nora Brandt, who farmed 80 acres alone on the ridge above Timber Coulee Creek, had spent good money on a pair of draft horses in the year 1973, when every serious farmer in Vernon County had been running diesel tractors for 20 years, and the last working horse team in the township had been retired in 1959. They laughed, not cruelly, mostly, the way farming communities laugh at something they're certain about. Let me tell you about Nora Brandt, because what she did with those horses only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from and what she'd been watching for the previous 2 years. Nora was born in 1942 on the same 80 acres she was farming in 1973, the second of 4 children of Walter Schilling, who farmed that ridge ground the way his father had farmed it and his grandfather before that, with a patience that people in the valley sometimes mistook for stubbornness. Walter Schilling was not a stubborn man. He was a precise one. He kept a ledger that went back to 1931, and he balanced it every Sunday evening at the kitchen table after supper. And the ledger showed him things that the neighbors who didn't keep ledgers never saw coming until it was too late. Walter had worked horses his entire life. He'd bought his first tractor, a 1948 Farmall M, only when his oldest son asked him to, and he'd kept the horses alongside the tractor for 12 more years, not because he was sentimental about them, but because he understood something about the arithmetic of draft power that the implement dealers in Viroqua were not paid to explain. Horses reproduced. Horses ran on hay and oats that you grew yourself. Horses required no parts from a factory in Racine or a distributor in Madison. When a horse broke down, you called the veterinarian, and the veterinarian's bill was, in Walter's experience, substantially less than the implement dealer's bill, and you could often treat the horse yourself if you paid attention. Walter Schilling died in January of 1971 of a heart attack in the barn during the morning feeding at the age of 67. He left Nora the 80 acres, paid for, with no mortgage and no liens. He left her $11,000 in a savings account at the Vernon County Bank. He left her his tools, which filled a workshop behind the house that smelled of linseed oil and cold iron. And he left her his ledger, which she continued in his hand-ruled columns without missing a single Sunday. He also left her his last 2 horses, a mare named Bess and a gelding named Dutch, both aged and both retired from field work by 1968. Bess died in the winter of 1972. Dutch died that following spring. Nora was left with the Farmel M, 80 acres of ridge ground, and a set of horse equipment in the barn that had nowhere to go. She did not sell the equipment. Now, the horses. When Nora Brandt looked at Gus and Henry standing in the mud at the Draper liquidation sale in April of 1973, she did not see what everyone else saw. She was not seeing a pair of worn-out animals from a failed dairy operation. She was seeing the last piece of a plan she had been building in her head for 22 months. Let me tell you what she'd been watching, because this is where the story stops being about horses and starts being about something else entirely. In October of 1973, the Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo against the United States. Diesel fuel, which had been selling for roughly 18 cents a gallon in Vernon County through most of 1972, would within months become scarce and then expensive in ways that American farmers had never experienced. But Nora Brandt had not waited for October. She had been reading the farm journals and the agricultural extension bulletins, and one particular newsletter out of the University of Wisconsin that discussed petroleum dependency in American agriculture in terms that she found, as she later described it, clarifying. She had started watching the fuel gauge on the Farmel M in a different way in the spring of 1972. She had started writing down not just what she spent on fuel, but what she would have spent if the price had been 10% higher, 20% higher, 40% higher. The numbers were in her ledger. She had calculated on the back of an envelope that she kept folded inside the front cover of that ledger that if diesel reached 40 cents a gallon and stayed there, her operating costs on the 80 acres would increase by an amount that would eliminate her margin entirely in a bad crop year and reduce it to almost nothing in a good one. She had also calculated something else. She had calculated what it would cost to return the 80 acres to horse-powered farming, at least partially, for the operations where horsepower was most interchangeable with diesel: cultivation, haymaking, some tillage. The horse equipment was already in the barn. Her father had taught her to work a team before she could drive a tractor. The knowledge was there. The infrastructure was there. What she needed was horses. She had been looking for the right horses for 14 months before the Draper sale. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a woman spending $45 on a pair of worn-out animals at a liquidation sale. They were watching a 31-year-old farmer complete the final acquisition in a 2-year contingency plan. She trailered Gus and Henry home that afternoon, put them in the barn her father had built in 1938, and started the rehabilitation that she had already planned in detail. Let me tell you about the work, because this is where Nora proved something about the difference between a person who reacts and a person who prepares. The horses needed 6 weeks of consistent feeding, regular grooming, and graduated exercise before she would put them in harness. She knew this. She had read it in the extension bulletins and confirmed it with the veterinarian, a man named Dr. Halverson, who drove out from Viroqua and examined both animals in May and pronounced them sound enough, with the caveat about Henry's hind leg that she had already accounted for. Henry's leg, Dr. Halverson explained, was a conformation issue, not a lameness issue. He'd worked that way his whole life. It wouldn't get worse under reasonable use. She fed them on hay from her own barn and oats from her own bin. She groomed them every morning and every evening. She walked them in the pasture behind the house, graduated to light pulling on a stone boat, and watched how they moved together, how they communicated through the traces, how Gus set the pace, and Henry matched it. By the end of May, she knew their working rhythm. The harness was the first real expense. The cracked leather she had bought with the horses was beyond repair in the traces and the collar linings, though the hames and the hardware were salvageable. She ordered new traces and collar pads from a harness supplier in Lancaster. Traces, $12. Collar pads, $8. Replacement hame straps and buckles, $4. She repaired the rest herself using a harness needle and waxed thread and a technique her father had shown her when she was 9 years old, working by the light in the same workshop where his tools still hung in the order he had left them. She pulled the horse-drawn cultivator out of the back of the implement shed, where it had been sitting since 1963. The shovels were rusted, but the frame was sound. She wire-brushed the shovels, sharpened them on her father's bench grinder, repacked the wheel bearings with grease, and adjusted the gangs. The cultivator had cost her nothing because it was already hers. The hay mower, a horse-drawn McCormick No. 9 that her father had bought second-hand in 1952, needed a new pitman arm, a cutter bar section, and a knife clip. Parts from an implement dealer in Soldiers Grove who still stocked antique mowing equipment because, as he told her, you never know, came to $17. The dump rake was intact and needed only grease and a new tooth here and there. Rake teeth, $3. She had the horses, the harness, the cultivator, the mower, and the rake. Total additional investment beyond the $45 for the horses, $44. Total investment in a complete horse-powered small grain and hay system, $89. The Farmall M she kept. She was not romantic about this. There were operations on the 80 acres that horses could not perform as efficiently as the tractor, and she knew which ones they were. She would use the tractor where the tractor was irreplaceable, and the horses where the horses were adequate. This was not ideology. This was arithmetic. She put Gus and Henry in the corn cultivator on the 14th of June, 1973, on a morning that was cool and clear, with the ridge ground damp from 2 days of rain, and the corn at the right stage for the first cultivation. She drove them down the first row and watched how they moved in harness together, how they read the row without much guidance, how Gus leaned into the collar on the uphill end of the field, and Henry steadied on the downhill. They had done this before. Their bodies remembered it, even if 11 years had passed. She cultivated the corn in 3 days. The Farmal M for that same operation would have used approximately 9 gallons of diesel. She used none. Her neighbor to the north, a man named Arlen Moe, who ran 240 acres with a pair of John Deere tractors and a hired hand in the busy seasons, came to the fence line on the second day and watched for a while without saying anything. He was a deliberate man who had been farming since before Nora was born, and he had the quality of some experienced farmers of being able to watch something carefully without committing to an opinion until he was ready. He watched her come down the row and turn the team at the end and start back up. He said, "Those are the Draper horses." She said, "They were." He said, "What'd you give for them?" She said, $45 for the pair. He was quiet for a moment. He took his cap off and ran his hand across the back of his neck and put his cap back on. He said, "Your dad would have liked this." She didn't answer that. She turned the team and went back down the row. But Arlen Moe went home, and he did not laugh about Nora Brandt's horses at the co-op that week. And when other men brought it up, he said he'd seen them work and left it at that. In a small farming county, a man like Arlen Moe saying he'd seen them work and leaving it at that carries a particular weight. The laughter didn't stop immediately, but it changed character. It became less certain. If you have ever watched a community slowly realize it had been wrong about someone, not in a dramatic moment, but in a series of small recalibrations, one neighbor at a time. Stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this one is just getting started. Now let me tell you what happened in October of 1973, because you already know what happened, and Nora Brandt had already prepared for it. The OPEC oil embargo hit the United States in October of that year, and by the winter of 1973 and into 1974, diesel fuel in Vernon County was rationed, expensive, and sometimes simply unavailable. The price moved from 18 cents to 32 cents to, by the spring of 1974, over 40 cents a gallon, which was the number Nora had written on the back of that envelope inside her ledger. It kept going. By 1974, it was approaching 50 cents, and the farmers who had built their entire operations around diesel-powered equipment were making decisions they had never expected to make. Arlen Moe cut back his corn acres that spring because he couldn't guarantee the fuel to cultivate them. A farmer named Dale Gustafson, who ran 300 acres in the valley below the ridge, sold one of his tractors to cover his operating costs and rented out 40 acres he couldn't afford to work. The implement dealer in Viroqua, a man named Bob Treichel, who had been selling tractors since 1955 and who had once, at a county farm bureau meeting, said that anyone still farming with horses in 1973 was farming in the wrong century, cut his own hours, and laid off his parts man. Nora Brandt's operating costs did not change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She had grown the oats that fed the horses on her own ground. She had put up the hay herself, with the McCormick mower and the dump rake and a hay loader that she'd found in the back of her own shed and restored for $11 in parts. The horses ate what the farm produced. The farm produced what the horses needed. The system was closed in a way that diesel never could be, because diesel came from somewhere else, from a refinery in Texas or a tanker in the Persian Gulf, and oats came from the field she could see from her kitchen window. She used the Farmall M for fall tillage and for the operations that genuinely required it. And she was careful with the fuel she had, and she had more of it than her neighbors because she had used less of it all summer. Her fuel costs for 1973 were 40% lower than they had been in 1972, not because she had rationed herself into hardship, but because she had replaced diesel consumption with horsepower on every operation where the substitution made sense. She watched what was happening in the valley and on the neighboring farms with the same quality of attention her father had brought to his ledger, not with satisfaction, with something closer to quiet sadness, because these were her neighbors, and some of them were good farmers who had made reasonable decisions based on reasonable assumptions that had simply turned out to be wrong. They had assumed diesel would remain available and affordable. It was a reasonable assumption. Almost everyone had made it. Almost. By the end of 1974, Nora had saved $4,200 above her normal operating surplus. In 1975, she saved another $4,800. The diesel crisis eased somewhat by 1976, but it didn't go back to where it had been. And the habit of watching fuel costs the way her father had watched every cost was now fixed in the county in a way it had not been before. Farmers who had never thought about petroleum dependency were thinking about it now. Some of them started asking questions they hadn't known to ask before. Some of them started asking Nora Brandt. She was not a woman who enjoyed being asked for advice exactly. She would answer a direct question directly, but she did not volunteer opinions, and she did not lecture. When Dale Gustafson came up the Ridge Road in the fall of 1974 and asked her, standing in her driveway with his hat in his hands, how she'd known, she thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "I read the extension bulletins and I did the arithmetic." Then she invited him in for coffee, and they talked for 2 hours about the specific numbers in her ledger. And she showed him the envelope with her calculations, and he studied it for a long time without saying anything. He said, "You did this before the embargo," she said. March of 1972. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You owe me a cup of coffee next time I'm in the valley." He laughed. It was the right answer. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 8 years, because this is where the story stops being about horses and a fuel crisis and starts being about something that cannot be taken from a person. Nora Brandt farmed the 80 acres through the rest of the 1970s with a system that had become, by now, a subject of genuine agricultural interest rather than county amusement. The University of Wisconsin Extension Office sent a graduate student to interview her in 1976. The resulting bulletin, which was distributed to farm bureaus across the state, described her operation in terms that were technical and admiring, and which she read once and filed without comment. She kept Gus and Henry working until Gus died in the winter of 1977, at the age of 15, and Henry retired from fieldwork the following spring at 16. She had by then purchased 2 younger Belgians, a pair of 4-year-old geldings she bought from a breeder in Crawford County for $210, which was more than she'd paid for Gus and Henry, but still less than a single tractor tire. She named them Walt and August, Walt for her father, August for no particular reason except that it suited him. She continued to keep her ledger every Sunday evening. The savings column grew in a way that was not dramatic in any single year, but was, over time, the kind of accumulation that changes what is possible. 4,000 here, 5,000 there, a year where the hay crop was exceptional, and the oat prices were decent, and she cleared nearly $7,000 above expenses. By the fall of 1981, she had $43,000 in the Vernon County Bank, and no debt of any kind. Then came the 1980s farm crisis, and you know what that was, and you know what it did to farming counties across the upper Midwest. Interest rates that had been climbing since the late 1970s reached 18% in 1981. Land values that farmers had borrowed against began to fall. Corn prices dropped below $2 a bushel. The farms that had expanded through the 1970s on borrowed money, buying land at peak prices, and equipment on credit, found themselves in a position that the arithmetic had always made inevitable, and that almost nobody had done the arithmetic to see coming. Vernon County lost 31 farms between 1981 and 1986. 31 families. Some of them were the same families that had been farming that ground since before the First World War. Dale Gustafson lost the Valley Farm in 1983, 300 acres that his grandfather had broken from timber in 1901. Arlen Moe held on, but barely, and only because he had a son working off-farm who could carry part of the household costs. The implement dealer, Bob Treichel, closed his doors in 1984, and the building sat empty for 6 years. Nora Brandt's expenses did not change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She had no mortgage. She had no equipment loans. She had no operating line of credit. Her horses ate her oats and her hay. Her tractor, the same Farmall M her father had bought in 1948, and which she had maintained with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, ran on fuel she paid for in cash and used in quantities that her ledger tracked to the decimal. She watched the crisis the way she had watched the fuel crisis a decade earlier, with attention and with sadness and without the particular kind of fear that debt creates, which is a fear that compounds itself, that makes clear thinking harder at exactly the moment when clear thinking is most necessary. In the spring of 1983, the Gustafson farm went to auction. It was 300 acres of valley ground, some of the best soil in Vernon County, bottom ground that had been producing corn and soybeans and small grains since 1901. The bank had set a minimum bid. There were speculators from Madison and from the Twin Cities who had been watching the crisis the way certain people watch any crisis, looking for the moment when distress becomes an opportunity for someone with cash. Nora drove down from the ridge in her truck on the morning of the auction. She had her checkbook. She had $43,000 in the Vernon County Bank, and she knew what the land was worth at Depression-era prices, and she knew what she could service with the income from the horses and the 80 acres above. And she had done the arithmetic on the back of a new envelope that she kept in the same place, in the same ledger. The bidding opened at $800 an acre for the bottom ground. The speculators pushed it. A farm credit investor from Madison took it to $900. Nora bid $950. The investor bid $1,000. Nora bid $1,050. The investor paused and looked at her, and she looked back at him with the same expression she brought to everything, which was the expression of a person who has already done the arithmetic and is simply waiting for the event to confirm it. The investor dropped out at $1,050. 120 acres of the Gustafson bottom ground, the best acres, the ones along the creek, went to Nora Brandt for $10.50 an acre, $126,000 total, which she paid by check drawn on the Vernon County Bank, cash on deposit, no financing. The crowd at that auction went quiet in a way that people who were there still describe the same way decades later. Not the quiet of a pause. The quiet of a community rearranging everything it thought it knew about a woman it had been laughing at for 10 years. The quiet of arithmetic arriving finally as a physical event. Dale Gustafson was there. He had to be there because it was his farm. He watched Nora Brandt write the check, and he did not look away. After the auction, when most people had left, he walked over to where she was standing, and he said, "Your father would have known you'd do this," she said. "He taught me how." He nodded. That was the whole conversation. Let me tell you about the years after that, because the land was not the end of the story. It was the confirmation of it. Nora farmed the combined operation, 120 acres of valley ground and 80 acres of ridge for the next 17 years. She kept horses throughout. Walt and August worked until they were too old, and she replaced them, as she always had, with younger animals bought at prices that remained, compared to the cost of equivalent diesel horsepower, almost comically small. She used the valley ground for hay and small grains, and a market garden that she started in 1987, and which, by 1992, was supplying restaurants in La Crosse and Viroqua with produce that the chefs described in terms that made her uncomfortable, but that she accepted because the checks were good. The Farm-O-Lam finally gave out in 1989 at 41 years of age, and she replaced it with a 1962 Oliver 88 that she bought at an estate sale for $300 and rebuilt in her father's workshop over the winter, using her father's tools and a parts manual she ordered from a dealer in Illinois. The Oliver ran for another 20 years. Her niece, a girl named Claire Schilling, started coming to the farm in summers when she was 12 years old, and by the time she was 15, she could work a team through a full day of cultivation without supervision, and could read a horse's movement in harness the way Nora had learned to read it, and the way Walter Schilling had learned to read it before her. She learned it in the same barn, with the same equipment, on the same ground. The knowledge passed the way knowledge passes, when it is demonstrated rather than explained, through repetition and attention and the particular patience of someone who has been taught, by someone who was taught by someone who believed that understanding a thing completely is worth whatever time it takes. In the fall of 1998, the Vernon County Farm Bureau asked Nora to speak at their annual meeting. She was 56 years old. She had been farming for 27 years on her own account. She had 200 acres of paid-for land, no debt, a market garden operation that supported 2 part-time employees, and a team of Belgian draft horses that her neighbors' grandchildren came to look at the way children look at things that are both ancient and entirely alive. She stood up at the Farm Bureau meeting and she said what she had been demonstrating for 25 years in language plain enough that nobody could misunderstand it. She said, "I want to tell you what I spent in 1973 to protect this farm from the fuel crisis. I spent $45 on 2 horses and $44 on harness and parts. $89 total. The farmers who didn't have an alternative to diesel spent, by my calculation, between $1,200 and $2,000 more per operation that year than they had budgeted. Some of them didn't recover from that. I'm not saying horses are the answer for everyone. I'm saying the answer is always arithmetic. Do the arithmetic before the crisis, not during it. Because during it you can't think straight and the numbers don't change just because you're scared." She paused, She said, "My father kept a ledger from 1931 until the day he died. He balanced it every Sunday. He never borrowed money he couldn't repay in a single season. He bought horses instead of tractors for as long as horses made sense. And he bought a tractor when a tractor made sense. And he taught me to ask not what something cost to buy, but what it cost to own. And what it costs to own includes what happens when the thing it depends on disappears. Diesel disappeared. Oats didn't." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Arlen Moe, who was 74 years old and had driven in from his farm on County Road B and was sitting in the third row, started clapping. Not the polite applause of a Farm Bureau meeting. The kind of clapping that means something specific. That means I was wrong and I knew it, and I'm glad someone finally said it out loud. Claire Schilling was in the back of the room. She was 16 years old. She drove home with her aunt that night, and she asked, somewhere on the ridge road above Timber Coulee Creek, whether she had always known it would work out. Nora thought about that for a while. She said, "I knew the arithmetic was right. The arithmetic doesn't care whether you're scared or whether people are laughing. It just stays true. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a pair of draft horses in a field in 1973? Most people saw the past. They saw obsolescence. They saw a woman who hadn't gotten the message that the 20th century had moved on without her. Nora Brandt saw a closed system. She saw feed she could grow herself, power she could breed herself, maintenance she could perform herself, a form of farm energy that had no supply chain running through a refinery in Texas or a tanker in the Persian Gulf. She saw $89 standing between her farm and a crisis that would arrive on schedule 7 months later. They said nobody wanted those horses. She wanted them. $89. A ledger her father had kept since 1931. A workshop full of tools that still knew how to work. The horses nobody wanted, in the hands of the woman nobody understood, until the diesel ran out and the arithmetic arrived, right on time, exactly as she had written it.